This week, we are jumping a little bit in the textbook so that we can talk about ethnographic field strategies and exactly what is ethnography within our qualitative research class. So within this module, you've got a few learning objectives. As you'll see, really in every module there's parts that are very important to recognize. So you want to be able to describe some of the problems associated with assessing research locales, identify the pros and cons of conducting research invisibly, recall the importance of planning for watching, listening, and learning in ethnographic research, explain how ethnographic research data is analyzed, examine how typologies, sociograms, and metaphors are used in studying ethnographic research. You want to be able to outline the two operations that form part of the process of disengaging from a field research setting, analyze the relevance of reflexivity as used in ethnography. Recall that the major elements in critical ethnography is addressing concerns on power and control structures, and outline the uniqueness of ethnography with respect to other forms of research. And finally, to give potential causes behind the failure of ethnographic field strategies. Throughout this module, we're going to talk about what exactly is ethnography, the terminological preferences, the purposes and goals, ethnographic processes, and micro versus macro ethnography. So first, let's talk about, let's actually define exactly what ethnography is. And it's a research method that puts the researcher in the midst, in the middle of whatever it is that researcher is studying. So, and from this vantage point, researchers can then examine various phenomena, various outcomes as they're perceived by the participants, and represent these observations as accounts within the data analysis. There's some different types of ethnography. Organizational ethnography. This is field research on the cultural dimensions of organizations. And we're going to talk about macro and micro in here in just a few minutes. So how do you get into the field setting? How do you access what you want to study? And you want to gain entry into the research locale. It can be filled with difficulties. Researchers need flexibility with your tactics and your strategies. You need to have knowledge of the people, the routines, their rituals. You need to understand the people's argot. Researchers, you should begin in the library. We talked about this before last week about the research that you would do and the prior research. You want to be able to have access through referral. That's the best way to get in. Elite settings is a term you need to be familiar with. It's research areas that are very difficult to obtain entry to because while elites are visible and easy to locate, they are able to establish barriers and obstacles and successfully refuse access to researchers, making them very difficult to study. So that's one of the first things you need to do is learn how to gain entry to where you want to research. Another way for a researcher to access a setting which they want to study is through outside observation or covert observation, where they can negotiate the researcher's role during that time. The researcher also wants to develop research bargains, and the bargains are between a researcher and the subjects. And this is where I want to mention the Hawthorne effect. This is when subjects know they are subjects in a research study, and then it can alter their usual routine and behavior, and they may react actually to the presence of the researcher. These bargains can also affect entry into the setting for the researcher. Researchers team with the insiders during these bargains. But you have to recognize that the bargains can be risky to the researcher. Researchers can also get into the field setting through the gatekeepers, and these are the people or groups who are in a position to grant or deny access to a research setting. The people and the groups are the ones, as I said, grant entry into the setting. They are formal or informal watchdogs, such as secretaries in an organizational setting. And access into that field setting may actually require mediation with the gatekeeper in order to receive their approval or disapproval, which can influence the researcher's entry into the field setting. Also want to identify the guides and the informants. The guides are the indigenous persons that are found among the group and in the setting to be studied, who are convinced that of the researcher's worth and value to the group, and therefore can help with gaining that entry. These guides and informants, they must be convinced by the ethnographer. They need to know the worth of the study. It must be understood by others, and they can offer an assurance of no harm, and the guides can provide necessary ongoing participation of the participants within the study. And I just want to mention one thing here before I move on, that just depending on the style of entrance that the researcher considers, whether they decide to go in overtly or covertly as an investigator is important. So, because each style of entrance will approach certain problems, and regardless of what you choose, you have to address the problems that you expect, or you need to identify the problems that you could expect. So an argument can actually be made for either style when you're conducting ethnographic research. So if the researcher has made the decision to be invisible, to consider themselves an invisible researcher, which gives them the ability to be present in the setting, to see what's going on without being observed, and consequently to really capture the essence of the setting and the participants without influencing them. This has to do with what I just talked about with the Hawthorne effect. So by being able to be invisible, we're able to get more real life observations. And with any field research, there are dangers, but becoming invisible within the research setting has dangers that the researcher really needs to identify, and identify solutions to those dangers. And the first one that we're going to talk about here is intentional misidentification. And this is really when the researcher, misrepresents themselves or becomes invisible in a study, and so they are taking on a role, or others are assuming they have a certain role within the setting. A good example of this, there's a great one in your book about the psychiatric, but also there have been researchers that have taken on the role of a prisoner and been admitted to a federal prison. And so, but the prisoners and even the guards assume that they are criminals and that they are offenders, have been sentenced to incarceration, and therefore they are treated that way. So they are putting themselves in a very dangerous situation. There's also the risk of accidental misidentification. If someone decides to research, we'll say, prostitutes on the street, and so somebody dresses like a prostitute and is actually down there and may even tell the prostitutes that they're researching. But there could be other people that accidentally misidentify them as a prostitute, and therefore that increases the chance of danger. There's also the danger of learning more than you want, and this occurs quite frequently, because we talk about this in our ethical, within the ethical class as well, in criminal justice and any ethics, in that if you're involved in a situation where you are invisible and you are or the participants believe you're someone else, let's say in a gang situation, and then the researcher actually sees illegal behavior or is asked to participate in the illegal behavior, this can become a danger. And this is where the certificates of confidentiality really become handy. And these are certificates that are issued really for a single research project, not really for class projects like the one you're doing, but they're issued by the National Institute of Health, and they protect the privacy of research subjects by really ensuring that the researchers that are invisible or covert, they cannot be compelled to release information or to testify against them. There are other dangers that I want to talk about as well during ethnographic research, and one of those is the personal emotional harm to researchers. We talk about this in ethics, where we are obligated under our ethical guidelines to ensure no personal emotional harm to the subjects, but this doesn't always happen of protecting the emotional harm to the researcher. And this again is something that's just not discussed openly. But there's if you are doing research on gang activity, and let's say that the gang members, let's say you're covertly, and maybe somebody in there does know that you're a researcher, and if you do see illegal behavior, but you could also see unethical behavior, and therefore it's putting that ethnographer in harm. The researcher can also be in harm just really because of the setting with which they put themselves. And so in order to reduce these dangers, the researcher needs to identify those prior to going into the setting. And there's really two distinct forms of danger that can arise during the ethnographic research, and that's the ambient and the situational danger. The ambient danger really is present when a researcher exposes himself to avoidable dangers, simply by really being in that dangerous setting. And the situational danger really occurs when they're within a setting, and whatever they're studying actually triggers a conflict between maybe the subjects and the researcher, or even just hostility from the actual setting in which you find yourself. It's very important, and this is something I want you to really take heed on. To become an invisible ethnographer, it is very important that the researcher, there's somebody that's involved there that knows exactly what they are and exactly what they're doing, so really can support them or back them up if the situation arises. And one last thing on becoming invisible, we're pointing out these dangers, and we're pointing out the barriers that an ethnographer will face, but you need to realize that it's very rare for a researcher to actually be harmed in a physical or emotional. But as with anything, we have to identify these, and a researcher has to be aware of these before they put themselves in that situation. Because ethnography really involves simply watching, listening, and learning when they enter the setting, the ethnographer needs to really be aware of exactly what they're going to do. So when they enter the setting, they really need to know what to watch and listen for. Need to take in the physical setting, wondering and planning at what they are taking in, map out the spatial elements within the setting, write detailed setting descriptions, write down the points of reference, first impressions. What's really important to any ethnographer is to write down as much of everything they're seeing and feeling, and then, as I say this when you do your own field research, you want to, at the first opportunity, to really go back over that and add more details, something that you may not have identified during that time. You also want to develop relationships with the inhabitants. As I mentioned earlier, the guides, you want to greet inhabitants, form relationships, You want to ensure confidentiality for all the inhabitants and the participants. You want to try and establish rapport with them, and you want to do the snowballing that we talked about earlier, where you talk with one who refers you to someone else. You also want to ensure that you're doing tracking, observing, eavesdropping, and asking questions. The tracking is really, following the guides, routines, or activities. Eavesdropping is very necessary in ethnography, where you're trying to take in everything that's happening around you. You want to ensure that you're tracking, observing. I moved to the next one. You want to make sure that you're locating the subgroups and the stars of your participants. So you want to really identify the central figures within the network of your setting. An example could be like I said, the opinion leaders or the stars. You want to obtain goodwill from the stars, and you want a good rapport with the stars, with the central figures. And that relationship could be critical to continuing your research. The most important part of doing ethnography to the researcher should be the ethnographic account, and this is where is considered the field notes. So you're providing really detailed narrative accounts on what's happening within the setting, on the subjects, and it's important that they are accurate and detailed. And these field notes provide 3 categories of observable experiences, the verbal exchanges, the practices, and the connections. And the verbal exchanges is that's between others or the researcher and others. This is where the eavesdropping can come in. Practices, various routines, actions, and interactions among and between participants is important to document. And the connections between and among observed exchanges and practices between the participants and the researcher and the participants. The verbal exchanges can include interviews, overheard conversations that we were just talking about, anything that's occurring between the individuals. The practices refer to the ways the individuals or groups say or do things routinely within the setting, and the connections refer to either implied or interpreted connections between observed actions, the interactions, and behaviors. There are many methods that the ethnographer can determine on how exactly they want to take their field notes. And so some use cryptic jottings, detailed descriptions, analytical notes. This is where the subjective reflections comes in, and subjective soaking, which is when an ethnographer, it's the process that occurs when the researcher really abandons the idea of absolute objectivity or scientific neutrality and attempts to immerse herself or himself into the culture that's actually being studied. So prior to going into the field, I really recommend that you decide exactly what method you're going to use to take your field notes. You need to consider the erosion of memory. Many people don't remember, and you remember too. Your memory can have lapses. That's why it's so important to you to document as clearly and as quickly as possible. And this is why many ethnographers take video notes, take a tape recorder, so that they don't leave out anything important. Also, I strongly recommend, as I've said before, that as soon as possible after leaving the field to really go over it, spend some time. Don't wait a day or 2 days to look at your notes. Put some time aside so when you leave the field that you can really document and add more to what you've put there. Something that you may not have forgotten at the time, something that strikes out to you later. These are all important considerations. As I said, there's different strategies for actually recalling the data after you've taken your field notes. You could just write down keywords and phrases. You could make a sequence of events. You could limit your time within the setting so that you don't become over-absorbed. Write full notes, as I said, after you're exiting, and write up your notes clearly before sharing. As one of the assignments in the class, you're going to share your field notes. Well, I don't want you to share the actual notes that you took in the field after you have come home and reviewed them again, added to them, and even writing them up in a more organized setting in a Word document before you submit. There's a really good example in your textbook of how to actually do field notes. And you can also probably, if you look at any of your articles that you're researching, you might be able to see examples of field notes that would be good to follow. Computers and ethnography. It's pretty easy to say that qualitative research isn't as quick to use computers as quantitative, but qualitative researchers are catching up a little bit. And so there's all different types of media that can be used in order to process and write down your field notes. There's also the new hypermedia ethnography that really permits researchers to include archives of their records, their field notes, even pictures, videos, and audio. Also, too, to mention here, we want to talk about online ethnography. So that seems ethnography can be used in the online society community, as well as it's when the ethnographer puts themselves in the setting on an online community, online format. It's similar in some aspects to really traditional ethnography, but it's different in some crucial ways as well. The ethnographer can really get into some of the online social worlds, like the multiplayer games, blogs, discussion boards, social media, and really the differences that from the traditional ethnographer, some interactions really only occur in cyberspace that you wouldn't find in any traditional setting, and it's an ease of access to subcultures. Also, too, that as we know, many people in the online community and in the social world are anonymous. Everyone has a different screen name than their own name, and so they can even many times open up and be more real in an online community. There are benefits for the ethnographer. Because now you can reach a global level of experiences. It's low cost. There are some similarities that we need to point out to traditional ethnography, and the time commitment can vary, and the information can be gleaned really from many sources. And after you have your field notes, after you transcribe them and even organize them into a Word document, you want to look at analyzing your ethnographic data. And so we're looking at, through the data analysis, you're looking at the plausibility of your hypothesis. And remember that it's not an exact science, and there's different methods for different data. The other point to make is you want to do a systematic analysis of your data. So after you've read through your field notes, you look at reinforcing your hypothesis or your themes. You might even want to develop new hypothesis after looking at your field notes, after taking your field notes. You want to do open coding that I've talked about before. You want to look at the patterns that are emerging. You want to make a record of the patterns that you're seeing. You want to you're going to decide on whether you do a content analysis versus actual textual accounts of your data. And one of the methods that's discussed in your textbook that you might want to think about doing with your narrative accounts is termed thick description. And this is an analysis that's directed toward drawing out a complete picture of the events that you observed, all of the participants that were involved, and the rules that were associated with the activities. Look at the social context in which these elements arise. And there are other analysis strategies that you can use, typologies, sociograms, and metaphors. And a typology is a systematic method for classifying similar events, actions, objects, people, or places into discrete groupings. It's a systematic method of classification. You might want to put similar events, actions in one area, and it really shows a distinction among these classifications. There's a couple different forms of typologies. You can do it the text-based or a photo-based. There's different processes to actually develop typologies. You can assess material, mutually exclusive categories, undertake exhaustive grouping of your elements, or even make theoretical meaningful appraisals of your elements. Another strategy for analysis are the sociograms, and these are procedures that allow the researcher to really make assessments about the degree or affinity the degree of affinity or the disdain that members of the group actually have towards one another among the participants. You could look at the consideration of friendship, social distance, and so on. Sociograms are a part of sociometry. Look at the sociometric test of basic characteristics on which you're looking at a specific number of choices used or the specific number of choices allowed. The preference levels are assigned to each choice. There are different versions of sociograms. There's the positive peer nominations, the negative peer nominations, and peer rating procedures. Again, you might here want to use the mapping in sociogram creation, which is really creating a social environmental map, and it produces a sociogram from your map that you've created. Another strategy you can use for analyzing your data might be metaphors, and these are descriptions that reveal aspects of the subject through comparison with other subjects, which everyone knows what a metaphor is from your English classes. An example might be saying the iron cage for bureaucracy or the revolving door justice. We hear that a lot when we talk about incarceration. All of this can really benefit the research. The metaphor creates questions. What does this situation seem to be? What else is it like? What does it remind me of? What can I relate it to? All of this, if you use the metaphor strategy, can help you, especially within your data analysis. And next we're going to look at the table of the sociometric assessment. Now this table really only shows the categories, so for a more in-depth, you need to look in your textbook, but you're looking for clear directions, numbered options, and detailed descriptions of your options. So now we're going to move to really getting out. We talked about how you were going to get into your research setting, so now let's talk about disengaging yourself and getting out of your research setting. So you have to really get out both physically and emotionally. So physically is really the physical removal of the researcher, the ethnographer, leaving the setting, not going back. Getting out is really devoid of emotion. It can be difficult for the ethnographer because we talked about sometimes the ethnographer really needs to be unbiased when they're within their setting, but it can be very easy to get wrapped up with the participants and become emotionally involved. But it's important that the ethnographer does get out without emotion. Avoid distressing a research community. You don't want to get out and leave leave the community or the setting worse than how you found it. We want to think about the possible effects on the group that you're leaving. So you want to ensure that you cover all these prior to you leaving. I also want to look at the emotional removal of the ethnographer. You need to disengage emotionally from the group, from the setting, from the research. You want to remove yourself emotionally from the relationship with subjects. Researchers are likely very concerned about the subjects, as I said, especially if you're in a sensitive setting. You worry about what's going to happen afterwards. And this is one thing, though, that really makes qualitative research so valuable, is that the ethnographer becomes attached and really feels, and therefore can really show that within their research. There are different nuances to exiting the field that the ethnographer needs to identify and really determine exactly how they're going to disengage. And there are many challenges to the disengagement that we've talked about. This next section, even though it's short here within the PowerPoint, I think is really important in your textbook, and that's why I'm going to really point out some of the discussion within the textbook. And I recommend that if you don't understand the reflectivity, that you go over it again in the textbook. I think it explains it very well. So it tells us that this reflexive characteristic implies that the researcher understands that he or she is part of the social world that he or she is investigating. So they're not truly an outsider. Ethnography involves activities that fall somewhere between rigorous, positive approaches and really naturalistic reflections. It's important that the ethnographer have that reflective concern on the part of the researcher. Also, too, a good ethnographer, it requires that they avoid simply accepting everything at face value, but really you have to consider the material that you're looking at as raw data. Ethnography is a process, as we've talked about before, of gathering systematic observations through participation, through various types of conversational interviews, through involvement. It can also require the use of photography, video, audio, and the reflexivity really, it further implies a shift in the way we understand data and their collection. And in order for us to accomplish how we understand that data and therefore collect it, we must make use of an internal dialogue that really examines what the researcher knows and how the researcher came to know this. And so to be reflexive is really to have an ongoing conversation with yourself. And I know many of us do this, and I do this many times within my own research. But so the ethnographer, I think this is really important here, and it's under 6.7 in your book, does not merely report findings as facts, but actively constructs interpretations of experience in the field and then questions these interpretations and how they actually got there. So an ethnographer is just not writing down what they see and what they're observing and what people say and the questions, the answers to questions, but they're really looking at how did they come to these interpretations. And another method along these lines of the reflectivity is what we're going to talk about next. And this is your critical ethnography.